You wake up before dawn in a dimly lit barracks, your body sore from yesterday's brutal training. The scent of sweat and dust lingers in the air. The barked commands of your lanista fill the space. You're a Roman gladiator in training, the ancient equivalent of an action movie star, except with a significantly shorter life expectancy. Welcome to the world of gladiators, where men and sometimes women trained to be unstoppable warriors, the ancient influencers of blood sport. And the transformation they experienced from inexperienced commoners to bloody war machines is startling. Strap on your sandals, grab your gladius, and prepare for a training regimen so intense that even your modern CrossFit instructor would need a break. The ludus is where gladiators were made, not born. Because let's be real, no one comes out of the womb ready to duel a dude with a trident. These training facilities were part boot camp, part prison, and part reality show, except there was no voting off the island, just fighting until someone stopped moving. Let's talk about the Ludus Magnus, the biggest and baddest gladiator training school in ancient Rome. If you think modern gyms are intense with their protein shake enthusiasts and mirror-flexing influencers, imagine a place where the treadmill is replaced with a guy swinging a trident at you. This was where you either got strong or got sliced. Roman records show that it was built in the 1st century AD, at the beginning of the Roman Empire, as one of the 4 such gladiator schools established by the emperor. I guess he had never seen Spartacus. Located right next to the Colosseum, the Ludus Magnus was basically the UFC Performance Institute of its time. For those picturing a cozy Hogwarts for gladiators, think again. The Ludus Magnus was less about magical spells and more about magical beatdowns. Just a stone's throw away from the Colosseum, this was Rome's top-tier fight club, except the first rule of Ludus Magnus was that everyone definitely talked about Ludus Magnus. And for good reason. The best of the best trained here, hoping to carve their names into history, preferably not by getting carved up themselves. You didn't just stroll in the Ludus Magnus wearing a toga and sign up for a membership. Most of the poor souls inside were enslaved or prisoners of war. If you were lucky, and by lucky I mean still breathing, you could fight your way up to freedom. You know, just like how working your way up the corporate ladder works today, except with fewer memos and more actual stabbing. The atmosphere in there was tense, but dynamic. That's because in addition to a training facility, it was also a melting pot of cultures. Gladiators hailed from all over the empire. Gauls, Thracians, Egyptians, and even former Roman soldiers who had fallen from grace. Each brought their own fighting style, creating a brutal but fascinating mix of combat techniques. Calling it the ancient UFC might not be such an outrageous thing after all. And the sounds, the smells, the blood. Picture this. The air is thick with the metallic scent of sweat, blood, and whatever mystery meat they were serving at the mess hall. The sound of clashing swords and the grunts of exhausted fighters echo through the open courtyard. Sunlight bakes the sand-covered ground, making it almost as unbearable as waiting for your food delivery when you're starving. And then there's the occasional scream of someone who really should have dodged faster. The doctores, basically the meanest personal trainers in history, ran the place. These were experienced gladiators who had survived enough battles to earn a teaching gig instead of an early grave. Their job? To whip recruits into shape, sometimes literally. You think your gym's spin instructor is tough? Try dodging weighted nets while a guy with a spear lunges at you. At least your fitness trainer doesn't carry a whip, unless you're at a very specific kind of gym. These hardened veterans weren't just barking orders. They were sculpting warriors with the precision of a Renaissance artist. Except instead of chisels, they used wooden swords and sheer terror. Found in great abundance since the 6th century BC, doctores were tasked with implementing various forms of combat training depending on the role or style of gladiator being trained. Were you a Myrmillo, hulking with a shield and sword? A nimble Thrax, dancing around your opponent with a curved blade? Or perhaps you got the short end of the trident and had to be a Retiarius, dodging and weaving with nothing but a net and a seafood fork. Whatever your fate, the doctore made sure you mastered your craft, or at least looked intimidating enough to get a good cheer before being skewered. These trainers were the real MVPs of the arena world. A skilled doctore was considered a prized possession of their owner. Imagine the ancient Roman version of a five-star Michelin chef, but instead of preparing gourmet meals, they were perfecting the fine art of dismemberment. If a doctore was really good, they could eventually earn their freedom after many years of service. Some even climbed the ranks to become lanistas, owners of gladiator schools, essentially going from gladiator to manager, like the ultimate promotion in a very violent corporate structure. Life under a doctore wasn't just about brute force, it was about strategy, endurance, and psychological warfare. Training arenas were filled with the sounds of clashing weapons, grunts of exertion, and the occasional yelp of a trainee who got too up close and personal with a training sword. Of course, not all doctores were merciless. Some were known for their tactical brilliance and took pride in mentoring their students, like Samuel L. Jackson from Coach Carter, if he was an ancient Roman. Others, however, leaned into their roles as gladiator boot camp instructors, embracing the chance to make life as miserable as possible for their recruits. It was all part of the process. And let's not forget the classic Roman motivational speeches. Strength and honor might have worked for Russell Crowe, but a doctore's version was probably something like, "Fight better or I feed you to the lions myself." A little less poetic, but highly effective. Despite the brutality, some gladiators looked up to their doctores like battle-hardened father figures. Think Mr. Miyagi, but with more scars and significantly fewer wax-on, wax-off lessons. And for those lucky enough to rise through the ranks, surviving long enough to become a doctore was the ancient equivalent of making it to the Hall of Fame, except the inductees had significantly more missing limbs. A typical day in the Ludus was brutal. You woke up before dawn. If you were lucky, your bunkmate didn't snore all night like a dying minotaur. Then came the intense combat drills. If you complain about sore muscles, the trainer reminds you that sore is better than stabbed. The afternoon was reserved for sparring matches. You either learn fast or you become an example of what not to do. And in the evenings, you would eat, sleep, and pray to whichever god you think might help you survive another day. First things first, diet. You might think gladiators were all about meat and protein shakes, but surprise, they were basically ancient vegetarians. Their diet consisted mainly of barley, beans, dried fruits, and grains. Think of them as the original plant-based athletes. Some scholars even compare their diet to modern-day bodybuilding meal plans, minus the protein shakes and Instagram selfies, of course. This carb-heavy meal plan helped them bulk up, giving them a thick layer of fat. This was, of course, not for aesthetics, but rather as a life-saving measure. Fat absorbed cuts better than muscle, meaning a well-fed gladiator could take a slashing blow and keep on fighting. Basically an organic, all-natural bulletproof vest. Training started with the basics. Before they ever touched real weapons, gladiators drilled with wooden swords twice as heavy as the real thing. Why? Because swinging a weighted sword for hours built strength and endurance. If modern athletes train with weighted vests, gladiators trained with weighted weapons, except instead of winning a championship, they were fighting for their lives. Imagine being forced to do an entire workout with a sledgehammer instead of a dumbbell. That was just a warm-up for these guys. Next, footwork. You ever see a gladiator fight? It wasn't just wild swinging and yelling. These warriors moved like dancers, except instead of pirouettes, they dodged spears. Trainers emphasized agility, balance, and coordination. If you tripped in the arena, that wasn't just embarrassing, it was potentially your last mistake. In addition to mastering movement, gladiators constantly worked on their technique. The paulus, a tall wooden post used for training strikes, was the most widely used piece of equipment in gladiator training. Picture shadow boxing, but instead of punching the air, you're hacking away at an unforgiving wooden pole day in, day out. Every move had to be precise. A sloppy strike could mean a quick death in the Colosseum. And let's face it, no one wanted to be the guy who got taken down in the first 5 minutes of the fight. Once the basics were drilled in, it was time for sparring. This was the real test. Gladiators fought each other using real weapons, though thankfully blunted ones during training. But don't get it twisted, blunted didn't mean harmless. A solid hit still cracked ribs, dislocated joints, and left bruises that made you question your life choices. It was all part of the process. If you survived training, you stood a better chance in the arena. If you didn't, well, let's just say the Romans weren't big on participation trophies. Imagine a terrifying mix of a drill sergeant personal trainer and that one gym coach who always yelled a little too much. Lannister had one job: turn recruits into killers. They didn't care about your personal goal, and that's how they were different from the Doctore. Their goal was simple: make sure you were entertaining enough to keep the crowd on their feet and the emperor entertained. Because in Rome, a bored crowd was a dangerous crowd. And if you thought all they did was swordplay, think again. Gladiators trained with weights, lifted heavy stones, ran obstacle courses, and even swam to build endurance. They needed strength, speed, and stamina. If they gassed out in a fight, their opponent wasn't going to wait for them to catch their breath. There were no timeouts in the Colosseum. After all that, did they at least get some rest? Not really. Sleep schedules were strict, and gladiators lived in barracks where discipline was harsher than your worst high school gym teacher. They were constantly monitored, and any signs of weakness, punished. A well-rested fighter was a better fighter, but let's be honest, no one was getting spa days. After months, sometimes years of grueling training, it was finally time for the big leagues, the arena. This was the ultimate test. If you survived, you became a superstar. If not, well, let's just say retirement plans weren't exactly a thing for most gladiators. But let's not forget, not all gladiators fought to the death. Despite what Hollywood tells you, many fights ended in surrender, and skilled warriors could become crowd favorites. If the people loved you, you had a chance at fame, fortune, and maybe even freedom. If they didn't, well, good luck. Nowadays, when we think of the word gladiator, we are inclined to imagine a muscled man in light armor, armored with maybe a shield and a gladius, wearing sandals. However, this is a simplistic view of ancient gladiators. This is because gladiators came in different shapes and sizes, and many of them specialized in various types of fighting in order to make themselves stand out from the rest. Rome had more gladiator classes than a modern battle royale game, each with its own special weapons, armor, and fighting style. If this were a video game, picking your gladiator type would be like choosing your favorite fighter in Mortal Kombat, except instead of fatalities, you were trying to avoid them. Perhaps the most iconic warrior was the Murmillo. Covered in heavy armor and wielding a massive rectangular shield, scutum, along with a gladius, the Murmillo was basically the ancient Roman version of a heavily armored knight. His helmet had a large crest, usually shaped like a fish, because nothing says intimidation like looking like a seafood special. Scutums weighed around 10 kilograms and were among the best military inventions in Rome. Dragging such a heavy piece of equipment was no easy task, and the Murmillo, essentially a walking tank, was best equipped to handle it. On the other hand, there was also the Thrax, who was the flashy, nimble fighter of the arena, armed with a curved short sword, Sika, and a small shield. They were designed for fast, darting movements, making them the ancient Roman equivalent of a lightweight boxer. If you liked speed, agility, and looking cool while fighting, this was your guy. The name Thrax suggests that these warriors came from the region of Thracia in southeastern Balkans, which Rome conquered in the 1st century AD. Now let's move on to one of the most interesting gladiator types that was common in ancient Rome. Armed with a trident, net, and almost no armor, the retiarius was the wild card of the arena. His job? Dodge, weave, and ensnare his opponents like a seafood-themed Spider-Man. They fought against heavily armored gladiators, making them the ultimate underdog. Think of them as the David to the Murmillo's Goliath. The retiarius really was the fisherman's worst nightmare, as well as, admittedly, one of the most unique types of gladiator fighters. The secutor, or pursuer, was built to counter the retiarius. With a smooth, round helmet that looked like a rejected Darth Vader prototype, his goal was simple: chase down the net-throwing nuisance and end him. Roman gladiators also included the hoplomachus, a tribute to famed Greek hoplites, who carried a spear and a dagger, along with a small round shield. They were like a crossover between a Murmillo and a Thrax, deadly, but with a touch of classical Greek elegance. Of course, gladiators did not only fight each other, they also fought animals. The bestiarius, as the name suggests, was the unfortunate soul who had to fight wild animals, lions, tigers, bears, and probably anything else Rome could find. The bestiarius' training involved learning how to talk to animals, though the animals usually responded with roaring and biting. Thus, the pool of fighters was as diverse as it could get. Such variance gave gladiator fights a tint of specialty. Rome's gladiators weren't just fighters, they were celebrities, warriors, and sometimes just really unlucky guys who picked the wrong career path. But no matter their role, they made sure every battle was unforgettable, sometimes for the crowd, sometimes for the guy who had to mop up afterward. So what can we learn from the ancient training of Roman gladiators? Discipline, endurance, and the ability to take a hit, both literally and figuratively. And maybe, just maybe, next time you're at the gym struggling through leg day, you can take comfort in knowing that at least you don't have to fight a guy with a net and a trident afterward. Despite the whole might die horribly part, gladiators who performed well could become rich and famous. Some were basically ancient celebrities, complete with fans who threw roses, or themselves, at them after a good match. If you were a real star, you might even get endorsements. Imagine a gladiator selling olive oil with the slogan, "The only thing slicker than this oil is my footwork." Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this deep dive into gladiator life, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. Otherwise, I might have to send a retired gladiator to be your personal trainer. Trust me, you don't want that.